Welcome back to This Week in Agribusiness. Max, one of the things we've been talking about is the geopolitical uncertainty around the world, and that's continuing now with a Brazilian election this weekend.
Well, how will it affect the producers there? The farmers who compete with us in the United States? Dr. Cesar Cruz joining us here in the studio from Advanced Trading. And you grew up in Brazil, correct?
I'm Brazilian, I speak Portuguese, so I know a little bit about Brazil agriculture.
Well, Dr. Cruz, let's talk about Brazilian farmers. That soybean crop in Brazil is going in the ground right now. What are the authorities expecting for this year's crop?
Well, let's say that CONAB is expecting that Brazilians are going to plant more acres this year. They're expecting that they're going to produce 3.5 more acres in Brazil this year for beans, 2.5% more corn also. They're going to export more corn and beans. For corn especially, they have just started an agreement with China. They haven't exported anything to China yet, but they're going to expecting that something's going to start happening maybe December, early next year in January, but you can expect good crops for both corn and beans.
Well, I'm curious about that corn crop, Cesar. We've got farmers in the U.S. concerned about fertilizer availability for this next growing season. How are they sitting in Brazil? Do they have access to the crop inputs?
Good question. Yes, they do. They bought a lot of fertilizers, especially from Russia. Right after in the beginning of the war, the conflict with Ukraine, the president visited Russia and made sure that they could supply those fertilizers to Brazilians. Prices are not very cheap, but they do have availability of fertilizers in Brazil.
You mentioned China. Has China made fairly significant investments in Brazil?
Investment-wise, they are buying a lot of agricultural products in Brazil. China is an important partner on the soybean side, but they haven't bought much corn from Brazil yet. So this is very hard to predict how much corn they can buy from Brazil next year.
You mentioned corn, and we think about that second crop, that safrinha crop, that hangs in the balance way out there on into next year. I mean, that really isn't in play at the moment, right? There is a first planting of corn right
Exactly.
now.
You're completely right, yeah. So right now, Brazilians are planting their first corn crop. And this first corn crop is actually stays domestic, so we're not expecting to have big exports from that first crop. And we also have La Niña effects that is actually leaving producers both in Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay worried about what can happen in Brazil.
La Niña.
La Niña.
The weather impact. This would be what, the third growing season for La Niña?
Exactly, the third growing season, yeah. We still have 60% chance that La Niña can have La Niña effects by December, January.
What does that mean in the southern hemisphere when La Niña is at work there?
We can expect drier than normal weather that can affect beans and corn during their growing season. So if that happens, we have to keep watching what's happening in Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay during December to see what can happen with their crop.
Did I read correctly that some Brazilian farmers just recently received rains to enable them to really get started planting now?
You are right, yeah. They just started planting. They are moving at a decent pace now in Brazil. We are going to see what can happen in the coming months. They expect to have good rain in October, some in November. The critical period would be December.
I want to come back to something you mentioned earlier. Frankly, I struggle with English, so I might have missed something in the translation here. Isn't the Brazilian soybean crop going to be huge next year? And what is that percentage increase that you mentioned?
In acres, 3.5%.
But what about total production?
Production is going to be close to 10% more production.
10%?
Yeah, and 20% more exports. I think that's important.
Oh, 20% more exports.
Yeah.
That's significant, competing with the United States, to be sure.
It certainly is as we look out to next year, absolutely.
Yep.
Well, thank you for coming in to share some insight with us. We know it's close to you, and it's on the minds of a lot of growers here as they get ready to move on through the harvest season. Many of them already thinking about next year, to be sure.
Happy to be back.
Thank you. We appreciate it. Cesar Cruz from Advanced Trading. Thank you all for joining us here this weekend on This Week in Agribusiness. We appreciate it. We look forward to seeing you next weekend. Have a safe harvest, growers. Have a great week.